Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. What is the connection between a major diplomatic book produced in New York and the formation of the United Nations Children's Fund and building bridges of understanding between the Muslim and Jewish communities? We'll be back in just a moment to talk about these and other important issues. Welcome back to our program. Today we're going to take a walk down history lane and look at some of the earlier days of the United Nations and compare to what happened years ago to what's going on today. My guest is an expert on the United Nations. My guest is Ms. Gloria Starr Kins. Ms. Gloria Starr Kins is the editor-in-chief and publisher of Society and Diplomatic Review. She is also a veteran United Nations correspondent and a correspondent for the Jewish Post newspaper and the Irish Examiner. Gloria Kins, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Thank you. It's an honor and pleasure to be invited. It's my first time that I've been interviewed in the UN. I've always been on the other side of the camera and the pen. So this is very amusing for me.
It's a different role.
Yes, completely.
Not to worry, not to worry. We're going to get into a lot of really interesting historical facts and items you've been involved with, but one that is really fascinating. But you put out a publication called Society and Diplomatic Review.
Yes.
What is the purpose of this publication?
Well,
it's really a very unique, it's probably the only publication of its type in the world, I would
well,
imagine.
It's the only little society publication that's very UN because it focuses on the Secretariat, the various diplomats here, and even some of the organizations that extend from New York and into Geneva. So, but I've been involved in this type of diplomatic action because I worked for the Diplomatist in London, and I was in London off and on for 10 years. And then also I worked with Richard Holman, who owned a diplomatic publication.
Well, this is a very interesting book.
And it was very popular, the Diplomatic World Bulletin. It was very popular here. It was more informational than mine, by the way. And the Diplomatic World Bulletin came out every month. Mine only comes out about every 9 months, like a pregnancy.
Yeah. Very good. Well, our viewers, if they'd like to read more about it, they can go to societyanddiplomaticreview.com and look at your website and get a better idea of what is in the book. But it just has literally dozens and dozens of photos of
a lot of work. They're my
movers
photos
and shakers at the United Nations and in various governmental levels and the private sector too, I might add. But it's really a remarkable book. Let's go back to your days with Governor Nelson Rockefeller.
Yes.
What role did he play in helping you to develop an interest in the United Nations, and what did you do to help link the UN community to the governor's office?
Well, actually, it started with Osborne Elliott, who owned the Tribune years ago. They were publishers, and Elliott Osborne came to me and said that Rockefeller needed somebody to be at the UN and call on the various heads of state, prime ministers, and the various countries coming in and accrediting themselves as a part of the United Nations who could speak French and Spanish. I speak English, but they needed French and Spanish. And at the time, America was very chauvinistic. You didn't have people speaking 2 languages or 3 languages. So Osborne was a close friend of mine. And at the time, I lived in Larchmont, and he lived in Purchase, and we were very good friends, same intellectual pursuits. And when he asked me that, I was thrilled. It was a $1 a year job and a great honor and pleasure. So that's where I started for Governor Rockefeller. He had an organization called the International Visitors Committee, but the International Visitors Committee didn't have anybody who spoke a few languages like French and Spanish. So after a while, I became the person who handled the UN for that committee.
And along the way, you've done a variety of things. I mentioned in the opening about the formation of the United Nations Children's Fund, UNICEF,
Yes.
which is probably the best known of all UN agencies, I would imagine. It seems like people in the U.S. and around the world are familiar with UNICEF and Trick or Treat for UNICEF. What was your involvement, and who was very instrumental in helping to launch UNICEF?
Well, that was Helenka Pantaleone, and she called me up one day. I'd seen her in the social routes of the UN at the reception, and she said, "I want to talk to you." And she said, "We have to form a Manhattan chapter. That's where the deep pockets are. That's where the rich people are. That's where really the social contacts are in Manhattan." She said, "Please help me form that committee." So I did with her. And there was another friend of mine named Harriet Greenfield who came on the committee. And then Maxwell Rabb helped, and his wife helped a lot. Maxwell was very important. He was the only Jewish member of Eisenhower's cabinet. And that's very needed in Manhattan because the Jewish community are a very affluent group, and they had to feel a part of this effort. Harriet Greenfield was also very elite Jewish real estate family. And then we had other different members who were also very important, but that was very key in New York because in those days it was Irish, Italian, and Jewish who were very powerful in the social community.
Another effort that you undertook, that you've been involved with, was dealing with one of the most intractable problems we've encountered probably in the history of the earth or civilization or people on the planet, and that's the sort of the misunderstanding or the gulf between the Muslims and the Jewish people. What involvement did you have as far as helping to start groups to build bridges of understanding so that there could be some type of rapprochement or at least dialogue with these groups?
Very frankly, my effort has not been just with the Jewish community, but all of these, if you read the Quran, all of these tribes are brothers and sisters. They emanate from Abraham. And in the Muslim world, you have the Sunni and the Shiite, but once again in the Quran, there's no word of Sunni or Shiite. So in the early stages, if you go back to the Bibles, there was only friendship and kindness and brothers and sisters and everybody cooperating with each other. And even in the Quran, when you have the questions today of the land and who owns the land, you'll find even in the early Bibles the question, "May I buy some land from you?" It's gotten very difficult after that because a lot of greed entered into the story. And a lot of people from the early tribal days, even though they did own land, they didn't have paperwork like we have today. It was honored. It was one family to another, and it was honored, and everybody knew whose property that was. And if anyone had children and it was divided, everybody knew the families. This is unfortunately eradicated a long time ago, and everybody wants to see where's the contract that you own that land. It's gotten things very confused. Even in the case of the old days when it was buyer and seller, there are no receipts anymore from all of those transactions, which has created tremendous controversy, in my opinion. I could be wrong. It's my personal opinion.
Now, the United Nations was created in 1945, June 26, 1945. It began dealing with, well, really came out of the ashes of World War II, but back in 1945, the issues that the UN was dealing with, not that you were there covering them at that time, I'm not saying, but as you've watched the United Nations evolve over the years, it's gone from 51 countries to 193 countries today in the General Assembly. As the institution has evolved, What types of differences do you see as far as the UN with peacekeeping missions? I know they had the first one in 1948, but dealing with problems such as Ebola, dealing with climate change, which a lot of people believe is the #1 issue affecting all people on the planet. How has the UN evolved over the years as you've watched it grow and mature and develop in these different areas?
Well, the UN peacekeeping is very important, and what many people don't realize is the guards here at the United Nations, many of them have had duties overseas and fought overseas, and now are back here at the United Nations. Many people think when they see a guard at the front of the gate or in the building that they don't realize these are fighters. These are very savvy security people. They're very high rank and very dependable. That's one of the parts. But as far as health, like Ebola, you have other people who are equally important as the UN, and that's Doctors Without Borders. You have a lot of the important NGO organizations in the UN. When you read about various Europeans and Americans who contracted Ebola, they were with NGO organizations that are accredited to the United Nations. So the United Nations gives them significance. It gives them recognition. And that's a very big part of the UN, is all of the NGO organizations working with the main staff of the UN and our Secretary General and our various undersecretaries and the various ambassadors. There are 6,000 people working here. It's a lot.
Exactly. Now, you're sort of the dean of the
I'm the dean of the United Nations Correspondents Association. And I'm going back now to the old days. It was very hard to become an accredited UN correspondent. The journalists there were like it was a smaller group. It was like now you had at the start of the UN 51 countries. You didn't have 300 UN correspondents in that day. And they were very dour and very difficult with you and watched you as a colleague. Are you performing? Are you straight? Are you doing your job? Are you dedicated to the UN? And also your byline. You had to have credibility, you had to have a distinguished byline, and you had to absolutely not be corrupt in any way. I think that tradition still exists, and I think it's still important, and I'm very proud to be a UN correspondent because it's very tough to live up to. It's not easy.
This brings up a really interesting point. One of the main issues that's come up over the years focuses on how little coverage the United Nations gets, especially in the United States. It seems to get better coverage overseas than it does in this country. And even though the polls, you look at all the polls, the Roper, Gallup, whatever, Worthland polls that go back to 1945, they show that the majority of the people in the United States, generally anywhere from 44 to 93% or 88%, something like that, support the concept of the United Nations, support the UN, but the polls show that we do not understand the United Nations. To what do you attribute that? Is it because we're not teaching the UN in the schools the way we did years ago, the way there's not one page dedicated to UN activities, perhaps the media's inattention to the other 80% of the UN that's dealing with humanitarian affairs? What's the root of that? Do you have a feel for that?
Well, yes, but we do have the Montessori school. And the Montessori school is very active in many countries like China. I forget because that's a question you're putting to me that I can't exactly identify what countries they're in. But the Montessori school here is at the UN. And there are a lot of the schools are contributing and working with their students to bring them into the UN through the Montessori school. And it's amazing. It's like a whole UN action. They have ambassadors, they have undersecretaries, they have the whole, the holy kip of the whole UN. I think more schools should enter into that cooperation with the Montessori schools. As for your previous statement, about there's a lack of interest in the UN or there's a lack of press. There's no lack of press. We have 300 correspondents here pontificating all the time, telling everybody what they think or don't think, and even sometimes the correspondents have different views and arguing with each other. But it's time. People who work from early in the morning to at night, people who have children, they have to get up, feed their children, they have to get the children to school, then they have to get to work, and then they come home at 6 o'clock and they have families, and they have to be responsible to families. They don't have time. So it's like a quick lunch sandwich. They may read in any newspaper or magazine the latest thing the UN says. If they want, they can dig more. But the news is there. In fact, the UN, whatever's going on in the UN, it's completely televised for anybody who wants to switch it on. So you do have students studying international affairs or politics who bother. But it's like everything else. It's time. Where is the time that people can have? Their own personal life and the need to raise enough funds to take care of their families takes up their time. They just don't have time. I don't think it's a lack of interest. I think it's time.
Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is an independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guest. Our viewers are invited to go to our website at www.globalconnectionstelevision.com and comment on this program or to make suggestions for future programs and future speakers and future guests. Today we're taking a look at the evolution of the United Nations with someone who is very intimately and has been intimately involved and is very knowledgeable of the United Nations. My guest today is Ms. Gloria Starr Kins. Ms. Gloria Starr Kins is the editor-in-chief and publisher of the Society and Diplomatic Review. She is a long-serving veteran correspondent at the United Nations. Gloria, we're talking about the United Nations and this evolution. Let's talk a little bit about what many people call the CEO, the Secretary General, who has the responsibilities of being...
We've had great Secretary Generals.
Please.
People may have complained, different countries have complained, they haven't had enough attention, but it's one man. And you know the amount of countries, you just stated it yourself, and so many hours in a day. But most of the Secretary Generals, wherever they can, go and visit the different countries where it certainly is, there's a political initiative to look into the real problem with the country, meet the heads of state, try and get them to negotiate more. But if you realize that Dag Hammarskjöld died in an airplane on a UN mission, to visit another country. But today, for a Secretary General to be able to visit every country is practically impossible. But Ban Ki-moon, the current Secretary General, has been visiting, I think, most of the countries in the United Nations. He's indefatigable. He's managed to, I don't know how many he's visited. That would be an interesting, to look into. But I know that every other day he's visiting another country. But there are only 365 days in the year, and somebody has to mind the store here. So how much time does he have? It's very important. But he has a very heavy schedule of visiting countries.
Being Secretary General of the United Nations is obviously one of the most important jobs in the world because the UN, as Madeleine Albright, the former Secretary of State of the United States, said, the UN is not perfect, but it's indispensable. You have to have a United Nations to help bring the countries of the world together, to help move aircraft, ships, mail, weather information around the world, provide peacekeeping missions, that type of thing. The Secretary General plays a critical role. I believe it was Dag Hammarskjöld, who was his second Secretary General, and Trygve Lie, the first Secretary General,
Yes.
was going out, and he told Dag Hammarskjöld, he said, being Secretary General is the most difficult job in the world. Do you think it's one of the most difficult? I think you just partially answered that a minute ago.
I do. I think you have to be really dedicated, and let me make one point here. None of them have made any money in the United Nations. They were paid whatever they had to be paid. They have been respected. They have been idolized. But these men have not exited as big millionaires at all. They're very, very dedicated people. And even U Thant, who was one of the greatest of all, he was very Buddhist and very serving to the needs of humanity. he was very broke when he died. Not just a case of having small money, very little to survive on until he died.
As you look at the United Nations and how it's evolved over the years, do you have any recommendations on how the UN can perhaps become more effective or more efficient? There's a proliferation, people say there's a proliferation of issues. Of course, there are more issues to deal with today. There are various committees at the UN, but there are the ways that the UN could focus on maybe becoming more efficient and more effective in its outreach in dealing with these problems?
Well, I think where it's important is in each country, when they send an ambassador, they have to think very hard that the ambassador is equipped to be here in the United Nations. This is a parliament. It's unique. In the average diplomatic post, it's an ambassador accredited to a country, and it's bilateral, but this is multilateral. So you really need an ambassador who is as educated in politics or in journalism, he has to be very talented because he has to negotiate with all of the various countries, and he has to understand the various countries he's negotiating. So it's multicultural, but it's also a parliament. You've got to know the thinking of your adversary or your colleague, and it's a lot of being a psychiatrist, being able to negotiate, and being how to understand the thinking of the other man and the country he represents. So they really need well-educated ambassadors. It shouldn't be the son of or the cousin of a family of the president or somebody who's influential in the country, or a nephew, or whatever it is. Some of them send into the UN and into the Secretariat UN family members to the UN. It's sad. They're not competent.
And that's so very important that the diplomats be qualified, they be well-trained, they be committed to working in this multilateral forum, because that's what it is. As you look at the United Nations, and we mentioned a minute ago that there are obviously shortcomings to the UN. Any institution has challenges, and the UN is the only entity of its type. As you mentioned, it's unique. There is no other United Nations. How important is it to have an international forum where you bring the 193 countries of the world together to deal with these problems? Everything from tourism to dealing with diseases to moving aircraft, ships, and mail, the way some of the items I mentioned a few minutes ago. But how important is that to have that in this world today? And could this world get by without a United Nations?
I don't think the world could get by without the United Nations and its ancillary organizations. As I said, there are so many NGO organizations that share this building and share its desires and its aims. And it's more than just this building and the Secretariat. It has UN offices all over the world. So it's a key organization. I think that, for me, I believe in it. But you have times like when we had, the United States was concerned because Russia had guns over in Cuba. Now, Cuba was only how many miles from Mexico? About 10 miles. And how far from the United States with the guns on us? Where was this negotiated? The United Nations. And the Saudis had a lot to do with that, because when the Russians first put all of their guns and all of their artillery there, there was very bad feeling in the building. And it was the Saudi ambassador at the time, interestingly enough, who spoke for 3 days without stopping till everybody would calm down and the negotiators could start coming to the table. So the UN proved itself just with that one incident. There are no longer guns in Cuba.
Exactly. And many of us do remember 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and how the world was poised to go to war. We were one button pushing one red button away from having not at that time, it was an atomic weapon exchange, but the same thing as the nuclear almost, with a little bit less energy. But again, the world's set on the brink of they were on the edge of a powder keg, and it could have happened. And a lot of people, really, the foreign policy gurus look at the United Nations, and a lot of them say that the UN has helped prevent World War III. Now, that's very difficult to prove, but we can't prove it, but we know some of the major issues that have come up in the past, and the UN has been absolutely critical in helping to defuse these, but I really, it's something that we could talk about forever, Gloria, and I appreciate you being with me today, and like I say, you have so much rich information to share, but Gloria Starr Kins, I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program. Thank you. I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us on today's Global Connections program.